First of all, I want to thank you again for all the messages. And Mariano, I think you all should have your reunion in the Oakhurst School, what used to be the gym. But Richard's afraid that the floor will give way. It's so old. But there's a story about that room too. When I first moved there, after I wasn't the first principal, I was next to the last, and in the gym there were these radiators, like sticking out from the walls, and I didn't approve, and so I had them removed. They said, "What if it gets cold?" I said, "Well, they're doing gym, so they get overheated anyhow. But I'm afraid somebody is going to fall into those radiators." No one thought of that before. Maybe I was wrong, but that's what I did. Nobody ever complained about it. And do any of you remember physical education in that room, in the auditorium, with a parachute? It was Mrs. Galatro was there at the time, and maybe Mr. Pagano, and they played with the parachute. I thought that was wonderful. I wanted to do that too. So that was fun. And also, do you remember that the library was under that room, and so Mrs. Fife, the librarian, asked the PTA to buy her a handy vac, because after each gym class she would have to go around and get all the dust off of all the books, because there was so much dust in those old ceilings, And then, that downstairs, the two classes downstairs, they had like cellar doors that you had to push open for the, I didn't like that at all, for the fire drills. And then Mrs. Lewis had an art room down there in what used to be the coal bin. And there was a window kind of low, because that was where they used to slide the coal into a chute down there, and there was no way out in a fire drill either, except to go past the working boilers. And I said, well, if we have a fire, it's probably going to be in this heating unit, and they can't walk past it. So I had the maintenance department build a little step ladder, and that's how they went out. They crawled out the window that used to be for the coal chute. It was very interesting at Oakhurst School, it really was. And that's what made it so wonderful and so much fun. Now, we talked about Mrs. Dallum at the Oakhurst School. She went with me, thank goodness, along with Mrs. Scott, the secretary, and Mrs. Thompson, the learning consultant, and we went to the intermediate school. Now, we talked a little bit about the first year, but I want to tell you about Mrs. Dallum at the intermediate school. Mrs. Dallum never let the custodians clean her office. Before she left every afternoon, she sanitized it. And I remember so well the times that she came and spoke to the parents a year before the 5th grade or the 6th grade or the newest class was going to come. We had an open house for the parents and talked about the program and so forth. And Mrs. Dallum always spoke, among other people, and she always said to them something like this: whether the children are physically sick or not, the teachers know that if they ask to come to the nurse's office, they will be permitted to come. She said sometimes it's not the physical things that bothering them, but they really just need a minute or two out of the classroom, or they need to say hello to me or something. And I never will turn a child away from my office. Wonderful. Right up my alley was down. Well, before I left, Mrs. Dallum retired, before I retired. And so did Mrs. Scott. And you know what? I have an idea I should have retired then too. So, when the new nurse came, her name was Mrs. Hughes, very nice lady, and the problem I had was I had no choice. She was the only certified school nurse who needed a job, so she was hired. She was very capable, but she was like an army nurse. And I invited her to speak to the children, to the children too, but to the parents of the incoming class. And she said to them, "I'm no babysitter. Unless they have a fever, or they're throwing up, or they're sick, they're not welcome to come to the nurse's office." Well, that was the one and only time I asked Mrs. Hughes to speak to the parents. Now, I have another story about Mrs. Hughes. She recently passed away, unfortunately, but she was like a Nurse Cratchit. That's the name that Mr. Donahue gave her. Mr. Donahue and I used to have our lunch in the teacher's dining room, and Mrs. Hughes had the same lunch period. I guess Mr. Fogler was in with his grade that time, because we always wanted to be where our class was, so I was usually with my class, and Mr. Donahue was with Mr. Fogler with his. So Mr. Donahue and I are sitting at a table, and Mrs. Hughes joined us, which was fine. And that day's menu was those little chicken
nuggets.
Right, and you dipped them into sauce or something. They weren't bad. So we're sitting there with her, and we all have the same thing. And she says to us, "Did I tell you, my stepfather is in the Veterans Hospital?" Oh, I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yes," she said. "He had to have, he has diabetes." And I said, "I didn't know that." And she said, "And yes, and they had to remove some toes." At which time, Mr. Donahue and I put down our chicken nuggets and never ate them again, because that's all we could think of. They were that shape, and we were never going to eat them again. It's too bad, because that was one of the best meals we had in the cafeteria. Now, I'm telling stories out of school. I guess I shouldn't. There was a speech teacher, Mrs. West, wonderful Mrs. West, and she was at the intermediate school, and she got very angry with me one day because I took her from her office and I put her down into the library in one of the fishbowl places, and she was very unhappy. We really were good friends. And unfortunately, she passed away too young. And that was a whole lot of excitement. And then Mrs. Fife got involved because she didn't want to give up the space in the office in the library. So, everything wasn't so easy. But we didn't let you know about the excitement behind the scenes. Have a good day.